Today's reading is from Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. Please feel free to read along by turning to page 3 in the New Testament portion of your pew Bibles. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." May the Spirit of wisdom guide our understanding of this scripture.
Thanks be to God.
Will you pray with me? Loving God, it is our prayer just now that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable to you, for you remain our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This week, there has been a lot of buzz about the big championship. The games that will determine the greatest of all time, the games that involve back and forth and the scoring and even a little bit of trash talking. Those games of which I speak, they are not the ones that are being played out on the football field. They are the ones being played inside in a sound studio in front of a television audience. Do, 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 do. The championship that will determine once and for all the greatest of all time. The game of Jeopardy has had some of us glued to our television sets. The championship that has made stars out of the most ordinary people with names like Ken and James and Brad. Each of these very smart but otherwise very ordinary people burst out of their relative anonymity, where they spent much of their time watching Jeopardy, reading books, studying trivia, while all the other kids were out playing sports. Each of them burst out of their relative anonymity, and by virtue of the circumstances surrounding their lives that they were so good, each of them has become a household name, at least in some households. Well, the same kind of thing, sort of, happened to Jesus of Galilee. The truth is that, like these contestants, Jesus' early life was lived in relative anonymity, relative obscurity. There are stories in the Gospels, a couple of the Gospels about Jesus' birth. There's a nib here and there about his early years. But these stories, remember, were told as much to explain who Jesus was as an adult as they were to describe who he was as a child. But on that day, on that fateful day when Jesus found John in the River Jordan, there were witnesses to that event, which meant that that day was the day Jesus became a thing. John was a big deal. He drew the big crowd. So when Jesus came to be baptized by John, and John, big John, protested, "No, I need to be baptized by you," there were lots of people who saw that exchange, and they had to be impressed that John would ask someone else to baptize him. Lots of people heard, or at least saw the exchange, I'm thinking, which means that they also heard Jesus reply, "Let it be so, for this is proper." Everybody saw that. And from that moment on, from his baptism on, Jesus of Nazareth was a thing, a first century thing, which meant that there was serious buzz around Jesus. He was, as we might say now, on everyone's radar. After that day, he met John in the River Jordan and was baptized. In the Gospels, Jesus' story really begins with his baptism, which is probably true for a lot of us who are here in this room, I imagine. Lots of us were baptized pretty soon after we were born. There was maybe a special worship service, a font in front of the sanctuary filled with water, family, maybe godparents. There was a big party afterwards. We may not remember much of it, but maybe we have pictures. Lots of us here today were baptized pretty soon after we were born, which means that our story, like Jesus' story in the Gospels, began with our baptism. Those of us who are raised in the Methodist or Roman Catholic or Presbyterian or Lutheran traditions were likely baptized as infants. Our baptism was a small part of the story of our birth. This form of baptism became common once the church became a little more institutionalized, beginning in the 4th century of the Common Era. Baptism became a birth sacrament. And this form of baptism had the advantage of giving parents in the congregation an opportunity to make promises about how they intended to raise and support their child. Our denomination, our little denomination, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, joins a few other traditions in trying to get back to the way baptisms were done in Jesus' day, when candidates, once they reached a certain age, for us it's around 11 or 12, would take some classes and make preparations and then get baptized. In the early church, the preparation time would be during the season of Lent. Baptisms would take place on Easter Sunday morning and would involve a practice that would seek to replicate the way Jesus was baptized, namely by being immersed in the water, being immersed into a body of water of some kind, after having made a decision, a conscious decision, to follow Jesus. Of course, nowadays, the denominations that perform infant baptisms go ahead and do a confirmation class that provides a rite of passage for adolescents, so there is a coming-of-age ritual. And our denomination and others who practice believers' baptism, baptism by immersion, we have baby dedications. We've seen them here where the child is promised over and brought before the sanctuary. So there's a lot more that we share in common than we might first believe. And it should also be said, especially for those who are maybe newer to our tradition, that our tradition recognizes all forms of baptism, and we definitely do not require a person who has already been baptized to get rebaptized in whatever way. But suffice it to say that by the time people in our denomination get baptized, young people 11 or 12, or older people, we have been known to baptize adults. This baptistry is big enough for you, in case you haven't ever had it done. By the time we immerse people into the waters of baptism, our stories have already begun to be written, right? Which means that the story we are taking on at baptism, the Jesus story, if you will, has to be added into all the other stories that have already begun to develop in our lives. The story of Jesus has to be sifted into the mix of the stories already there. Now, about the time I was baptized, when I was probably in 7th grade, I was also a first-year student at Surrattsville Junior High School, 7th grade. And at about that time, Prince George's County decided, kind of ahead of its time, that boys would benefit from taking that class that had previously only been offered to girls. That class called Home Economics, or Home Ec. Do we have some Home Economics graduates here? I don't even know, they still teach it. So I'm sure with a lot of bravado and bluster, us 7th grade boys joined the 7th grade girls in home ec class. So we could learn how to sew on a button, iron a shirt, do a little laundry, and make our way around the kitchen. I remember that one of the first things we did in home ec class was to bake chocolate chip cookies. Each of us, there's 4 of us around the table, we all had our own ingredients. And it just so happened that my job was to add the vanilla to the mix. Add 2 or 3 drops of vanilla to the cookie dough. I remember feeling cheated because I only got to add 2 or 3 drops of my ingredient. Everyone else had measuring cups full. But the teacher said, the vanilla is what makes the cookies taste good. Well, sometimes I would suggest that adding the story of Jesus to the stories that are already in the mix of our lives is like adding vanilla to the cookie dough. Sometimes the Jesus story makes the other stories so much better. The instinct, for instance, to help around the house is enhanced perhaps by the story of Jesus telling his people, if someone asks you to walk a mile with him or her, why don't you walk too? What else can I do to help? Dad? The Jesus story. Telling a 6th grader the story of the Good Samaritan, that story about the outcast offering help, might one day be recalled, one might hope, when that person comes across a freshman in high school who was roughed up earlier that day at school by the soccer team for coming to the defense of the kid who was being picked on. The Jesus story. It's good. Vanilla in the chocolate chip cookie dough. Then, I don't know, I'm thinking that the challenge of baptism, especially believers' baptism, is that sometimes the stories of Jesus call those other stories into question, the stories that have been developing. Sometimes by the time we get baptized into the story of Jesus, we've already been baptized into other stories that do not square so well with the story of the young man being baptized by John. Sometimes the stories of Jesus make something other than chocolate chip cookie dough out of the mix. By the time I had been baptized into the story of Jesus, I had already been baptized into a number of other stories that were at odds with this new one. And no one really told me about it. For instance, by the time I was baptized into the story of Jesus, which encourages us to believe that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, by that time, my neighborhood had already baptized me into the good old-fashioned story of Southern Maryland racism. On that day when I overheard the alarm in our neighbor's voice, did you know that the family next door is having trouble selling their house? They might have to sell it to blacks. That was my teenage reality. To be fair, that story wasn't challenged all that much by the members of our congregation, many of whom greeted the civil rights protests which were going strong in nearby D.C. as mostly a traffic nuisance. Why do they want so much? By the time I was baptized into the story of Jesus, in which Jesus sticks up for the woman who was caught in adultery, by that time I had already been fully baptized into what is now excused as locker room banter, where boys talk about girls in shameful ways, and where no boy in his right mind would dare to be the one to risk his neck and maybe his reputation by standing up for whomever was the object of derision. That was not part of the deal, I didn't think, in baptism preparation class. And meanwhile, over at the church, it was true that if a girl in the youth group happened to get pregnant, it was mostly her scandal and not his. By the time I was baptized into the story of Jesus, who challenged the people of his day by saying things like, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if a man strikes you on one cheek, turn and offer him the other." By the time I was immersed into the waters of baptism as a 12-year-old, the middle school code of conduct, which called for exacting revenge for an affront to one's pride, was firmly in place. And if you didn't do it, well, you suffered the consequences. The story of Jesus, I learned on Sunday mornings, included poetic readings like, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares." But on most weekday evenings, we were all playing Little League baseball over at Andrews Air Force Base while F-15s practiced taking off and landing in preparation for being over in Vietnam. All of us, we all live in the real world where the various stories of our lives, they bump up against one another. All of us experience the dissonance inherent in living out of several different kinds of stories. But I think it might be interesting for us to take just a moment and take stock of where the Jesus story, into which we've all been formally baptized, where it fits in, where it ranks with the other stories of our lives, into which we have perhaps less formally been baptized. The evangelical branch of the Christian family tree has had its hands full with this dissonance the last 3 years, haven't they? There is this man who is our president, who may be able to stand up for some of the causes that have always been near to the hearts of some of the folks that are part of our Christian tradition. But oh, the story of this man who happens to be the champion of their causes. For some, the dissonance has become too much and they have said no, but for others, there is the silence of Pontius Pilate quietly washing his hands. But that's too easy, isn't it? Looking at how others sprinkle drops of vanilla into the mix. Because it's an issue for all of us. All of us, that is, who've been baptized, all of us who've been trying to figure out how the story of Jesus fares with all the other stories that make us who we are. So this morning, let's just do this. Let's just imagine John the Baptist walking into the sanctuary and getting us all fired up about the story of Jesus. If we were to hear that sermon and if we were to say, yes, I want to be baptized, I want to follow, if that were to happen, what about our lives would need to change? What would we finally stop doing that we've been meaning to stop? What would we begin that we've been meaning to get started with? This morning, if we had a chance to sprinkle a few drops of vanilla into the mix, how would it change that mix? And what would the cookies taste like? One day, Jesus came to be baptized by John. That day changed everything.